The threats posed by climate change are grave, complex, and urgent. Sadly, in the 5 years since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, in part because of this country's withdrawal from that accord and from an absence of U.S. leadership on the world stage, the progress we have made has been inadequate, and the evidence of damage done by climate change continues to accumulate in alarming fashion. A proliferation of extreme weather-related events like wildfires, droughts, hurricanes, and floods dominate the headlines. Countless lives have been lost. Untold livelihoods have been destroyed. The remedies required to address this crisis call on all areas of human knowledge and demand collective action across national and international borders. Organizations like the United Nations and institutions like Columbia have long recognized their special obligation to help lead in this fight, for they have the capacities and the will to address this existential threat in ways that will make a difference. The Paris Climate Agreement remains the signal example of the sort of coordinated international response we must see. And it is, of course, essential that the incoming administration has pledged that the United States will be rejoining the accord. The Secretary General and all who have worked on the Paris Agreement deserve enormous credit for getting it done. There must be much more of this kind of collaboration among nations, with the United States centrally involved, and I am hopeful and confident that we will be seeing new partnerships of this sort in the months and years ahead. For our part, here at Columbia, we've long been at the forefront of discovery in climate science and policy. The very idea of global warming began here with our scientists. We have some of the best researchers in the world working at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, through the Earth Institute, and across the university. Yet, in recent years, trying to be self-critical, we have embarked on a structured and systematic review of the question whether we are doing enough on the issue of climate, whether we were marshaling our academic resources in ways that were in line with the magnitude and the gravity of the challenges. That examination has led most significantly to the announcement in July that Columbia will be creating a School of Climate, the first new school established at this university in a quarter century. There is much work to be done to succeed in having this endeavor reach its full potential and to maximize Columbia's contributions in response to climate change. We will soon have more to share publicly about the initial cohort of students to be enrolled in the climate school, something we look forward to with great anticipation and enthusiasm. Now let me turn to our guest, United Nations Secretary General António Guterres. Before taking office as the UN's 9th Secretary General in 2017, Mr. Guterres had previously served as Prime Minister of Portugal and as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. It has become clear to many of us here at Columbia and increasingly across higher education that universities must do more to supplement the overtaxed and often inadequate structures of national governance that are in place for addressing major problems in the world. And in welcoming Secretary General Guterres, we are joined today by a leader who I think we can safely say feels committed to achieving innovative and meaningful solutions to climate change using all available resources, and indeed, this is someone who feels the urgency of the challenge with the unique and powerful sense of responsibility. We are pleased that Columbia University is an ideal setting to host the Secretary General for his important remarks on climate and the future of the planet. We are thrilled that he is here with us today. Please join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
President Bollinger, dear friends, I thank Columbia University for hosting this gathering, and I welcome those joining online around the world. We meet in this unusual way as we enter the last months of this most unusual year. We are facing a devastating pandemic, new heights of global heating, new lows of ecological degradation, and new setbacks in our work towards global goals for more equitable, inclusive, and sustainable development. To put it simply, the state of the planet is broken. Dear friends, humanity is waging war on nature. This is suicidal. Nature always strikes back, and it is already doing so with growing force and fury. Biodiversity is collapsing. 1 million species are at risk of extinction. Ecosystems are disappearing before our eyes. Deserts are spreading, wetlands are being lost. Every year we lose 10 million hectares of forest. Oceans are overfished and choking with plastic waste. The carbon dioxide they absorb is acidifying the seas. Coral reefs are bleached and dying. Air and water pollution are killing 9 million people annually, more than 6 times the current toll of the pandemic. And with people and livestock encroaching further into animal habitats and disrupting wild spaces, we could see more viruses and other disease-causing agents jump from animals to humans. Let's not forget that 75% of new and emerging human infectious diseases are zoonotic. Today, 2 new authoritative reports from the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Programme spell out how close we are to climate catastrophe. 2020 is on track to be one of the 3 warmest years on record globally, even with the cooling effect of this year's La Niña. The past decade was the hottest in human history. Ocean heat is at record levels. And this year, more than 80% of the world's oceans experience marine heat waves. In the Arctic, 2020 has seen exceptional warms, with temperatures more than 3 degrees Celsius above average and more than 5 degrees in northern Siberia. Arctic sea ice in October was the lowest on record, and now refreezing has been the slowest on record. Greenland ice has continued its long-term decline, losing an average of 278 gigatons a year. Permafrost is melting, and so releasing methane, a potent greenhouse gas. Apocalyptic fires and floods, cyclones and hurricanes are increasingly the new normal. The North Atlantic hurricane season has seen 30 storms, more than double the long-term average, and breaking the record for a full season. And Central America is still reeling from 2 back-to-back hurricanes, part of the most intense period for such storms in recent years. Last year, such disasters cost the world $150 billion. COVID-19 lockdowns have temporarily reduced the emissions and pollution. But carbon dioxide levels are still at record highs and rising. In 2019, carbon dioxide levels reached 148% of pre-industrial levels. In 2020, the upward trend has continued despite the pandemic. Methane soared even higher to 260%. And nitrous oxide, a powerful greenhouse gas, but also a gas that harms the ozone layer, has escalated by 123%. Meanwhile, climate policies have yet to rise to the challenge. Emissions are 62% higher now than when international climate negotiations began in 1990. Every tenth of a degree of warming matters. And today we are at 1.2 degrees of warming and already witnessing unprecedented climate extremes and volatility in every region and on every continent. We are headed for a thundering temperature rise of 3 to 5 degrees Celsius this century. And the science is crystal clear. To limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, the world needs many things, but for instance, to decrease fossil fuel production by roughly 6% every year between now and 2030. Instead, we are going in the opposite direction. It is planned that we'll have an annual increase of 2%. The fallout of the assault on our planet is impeding our efforts to eliminate poverty and imperiling food security, and is making our work for peace even more difficult as the disruptions drive instability, displacement, and conflict. It's no coincidence that 70% of the most climate vulnerable countries are also among the most politically and economically fragile. And it's not happenstance that of the 15 countries most susceptible to climate risks, 8 host a United Nations peacekeeping or special political mission. As always, the impacts fall most heavily on the world's most vulnerable people. Those who have done the least to cause the problem are suffering the most. And even in the developed world, the marginalized are the first victims of disasters and the last to recover. Dear friends, let's be clear. Human activities are at the root of our descent towards chaos. But that means that human action can help solve it. Making peace with nature is the defining task of the 21st century. It must be the top priority for everyone, everywhere. In this context, the recovery from the pandemic is an opportunity. We can see rays of hope in the form of a vaccine, but there is no vaccine for the planet. Nature needs a bailout. In overcoming the pandemic, we can also avert climate cataclysm and restore our planet. This is an epic policy test, but ultimately, this is a moral test. The trillions of dollars needed for COVID recovery is money that we are borrowing from future generations, every last penny. And we cannot use those resources to lock in policies that burden them with a mountain of debt on a broken planet. It is time to flick the green switch. We have a chance not simply to reset the world economy, but to transform it. A sustainable economy driven by renewable energies will create new jobs, cleaner infrastructure, and a resilient future. And an inclusive world will help ensure that people can enjoy better health and the full respect of their human rights and live with dignity on a healthy planet. COVID recovery and our planet's repair must be the two sides of the same coin. Dear friends, let me start with the climate emergency. We face three imperatives in addressing the climate crisis. First, we need to achieve global carbon neutrality within the next 3 decades. Second, we have to align global finance between the Paris Agreement, the world's blueprint for climate action. And third, we must deliver a breakthrough on adaptation to protect the world, and especially the most vulnerable people and countries, from climate impacts. Let me take these in turn. First, carbon neutrality, net zero emissions of greenhouse gases. In recent weeks, we have seen important positive developments. The European Union had already committed to become the first climate-neutral continent by 2050, and I expect it will decide to reduce its emissions to at least 55% below 1990 levels by 2030. The United Kingdom, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and more than 110 countries have committed to carbon neutrality by 2050. The incoming United States administration has announced exactly the same goal. And China has committed to get there before 2060. This means that by early next year, countries representing more than 65% of global carbon dioxide emissions and more than 70% of the world economy will have made ambitious commitments to carbon neutrality. We must turn this momentum into a movement. And so the central objective of the United Nations for 2021 is to build a truly global coalition for carbon neutrality. I firmly believe that 2021 can be a new kind of leap year, the year of a quantum leap towards carbon neutrality. Every country, city, financial institution and company should adopt plans for transitioning to net zero emissions by 2050. And I encourage the main emitters to lead the way in taking decisive action now to get on the right path and to achieve this vision, which means cutting global emissions by 45% by 2030 compared with 2010 levels. And this must be clear in the national determined contributions. And every individual must also do their part, as consumers, as producers, and as investors. Technology is on our side, and sound economic analysis is our ally. More than half the coal plants operating today cost more to run than building new renewables from scratch. The coal business is going up in smoke. The International Labour Organization estimates that, despite inevitable job losses, the clean energy transition will result in the creation of 18 million jobs by 2030. But a just transition is also absolutely critical. We must recognize the human costs of energy shift. Social protection, temporary basic income, reskilling and upskilling can support workers, and these the changes caused by decarbonization. Dear friends, renewable energy is now the first choice, not just for the environment, but for the economy. But there are worrying signs. Some countries have used the crisis to roll back environmental protections. Others are expanding natural resource exploitation and retreating from climate ambition. And the G20 members, in their rescue packages, are now spending 50% more on sectors linked to fossil fuel production and consumption than on low-carbon energy. Beyond announcements, all must pass a credibility test. Let me take one example, the example of shipping. If the shipping sector was a country, it would be the world's 6th biggest greenhouse gas emitter. At last year's Climate Action Summit, we launched the Getting to Zero Shipping Coalition to push for zero emissions deep-sea vessels by 2030. Yet, current policies are not in line with those pledges. We need to see enforceable regulatory and fiscal steps so that the shipping industry can deliver its commitments. Otherwise, the net zero ship will have sailed. And exactly the same applies to aviation. Dear friends, the Paris signatories are obligated to submit their revised and enhanced national determined contributions with their 2030 emissions cut targets. 10 days from now, along with France and the United Kingdom, I am convening a Climate Ambition Summit to mark the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. Less than a year from now, we will meet in Glasgow for COP26. These moments are opportunities we cannot miss for nations to detail how they will build forward and build better, acknowledging the common but differentiated responsibility in line of national circumstances, as said in the Paris Agreement, but with the common goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. Second, let me now turn to the key question of finance. The commitments to net zero emissions are sending a clear signal to investors, markets, and finance ministers. But we need to go further. We need all governments to translate these pledges into policies, plans, and targets with specific timelines. These will provide certainty and confidence for businesses and the financial sector to invest for net zero. It is time to put a price on carbon, to phase out fossil fuel finance and end fossil fuel subsidies, to stop building new coal power plants and halt coal power financing domestically and overseas, to shift the tax burden from income to carbon, from taxpayers to polluters, to integrate the goal of carbon neutrality into all economic and fiscal policies and decisions, and to make climate-related financial risk disclosures mandatory. Funding should flow to the green economy, to resilience and adaptation, and to just transition programs. And we need to align all public and private financial flows behind the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. Multilateral, regional, and national development institutions and private banks must all commit to align their lending to the global net zero objective. And I call on all asset owners and managers to decarbonize their portfolios and to join key initiatives and partnerships launched by the United Nations, including the Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance and the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, today with $5.1 trillion of assets. Companies need to adjust their business models, and the investors need to demand information from companies on the resilience of those models. And world pension funds that manage $32 trillion in assets, putting them in a unique position to move the needle, must move the needle and lead the way. I appeal to developed countries to fulfill their long-standing promise to provide $100 billion annually to support developing countries in reaching our shared climate goals. And we are not there yet. And this is a matter of equity, fairness, solidarity, and enlightened self-interest. And I ask all countries to reach a compromise on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement as they prepare for COP26 to get us the clear, fair, and environmentally sound rules carbon markets need to fully function. And I welcome the work of the task force launched in September, with members representing 20 sectors and 6 continents, to develop a blueprint for large-scale private carbon offset markets. Third, we need a breakthrough on adaptation and resilience. We are in a race against time to adapt to a rapidly changing climate. And adaptation must not be the forgotten component of climate action. Until now, adaptation represents only 20% of climate finance, reaching $30 billion on average in 2017 and 2018. This hinders our essential work for disaster risk reduction. And it also isn't smart. The Global Commission on Adaptation found that every dollar invested in adaptation can yield almost $4 in benefits. We have both a moral imperative and a clear economic case for supporting developing countries to adapt and build resilience to current and future climate impacts. Before COP26, all donors and the multilateral and national development banks should commit to increase the share of adaptation and resilience finance to at least 50% of their climate finance support. Early warning systems, climate-resilient infrastructure, improved dryland agriculture, mangrove protection, and other steps can give the world a double dividend, avoiding future losses and generating economic gains and other benefits. We need to move to large-scale, preventive and systematic adaptation support. And this is especially urgent for small island developing states which face an existential threat. The race to resilience is as important as the race to net zero. Dear friends, but we must remember there can be no separating climate action from the larger planetary picture. Everything is interlinked, the global commons and global well-being. That means we must act more broadly, more holistically, more across many fronts to secure the health of our planet on which all life depends. Nature feeds us, clothes us, quenches our thirst, generates our oxygen, shapes our culture and our faces, and forges our very identity. 2020 was supposed to have been a super year for nature, but the pandemic has had other plans for us. But now we must use 2021 to address our planetary emergency. Next year, countries will meet in Kunming to forge a post-2020 biodiversity framework to halt the extinction crisis and put the world on a pathway to living in harmony with nature. The world has not met any of the global biodiversity targets set for 2020. And so we need much more ambition and greater commitment to deliver on measurable targets and means of implementation, particularly finance and monitoring mechanism. And this means more and bigger, effectively managed conservation areas so that our assault on species and ecosystems can be halted, biodiversity positive agriculture and fisheries, reducing our overexploitation and destruction of the natural world, phasing out negative subsidies, the subsidies that destroy healthy soils, pollute our waterways, and lead us to fish our oceans empty, shift from unsustainable and nature-negative extractive resource mining and to broader sustainable consumption patterns. Because biodiversity is not just cute and charismatic wildlife, it is the living, breathing web of life. Also in 2021, countries will hold the Ocean Conference to protect and advance the health of the world's marine environments. Overfishing must stop. Chemical and solid waste pollution, plastics in particular, must be reduced drastically. Marine reserves must increase significantly, and coastal areas need greater protection. The blue economy offers remarkable potential. Already, goods and services from the ocean generate $2.5 trillion each year and contribute over 31 million direct full-time jobs, at least until the pandemic struck. We need urgent action on a global scale to reap these benefits, but to protect the world's seas and oceans from the many pressures they face. Next year's Global Conference on Sustainable Transport in Beijing must also strengthen this vital sector while addressing its negative environmental footprint. And the Food Systems Summit must aim to transform global food production and consumption. Food systems are one of the main reasons why we are failing to stay within our planet's ecological boundaries. At the beginning of 2021, we will launch the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, focused on preventing, halting and reversing the degradation of forests, land and other ecosystems worldwide. The decade is a rallying cry for all who want to tackle the twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate change with practical and hands-on action. The International Conference on Chemicals Management will establish a post-2020 framework on chemicals and waste. And according to the World Health Organization, sound chemicals management could prevent at least 1.6 million deaths per year. 2021 will also be critical in advancing the new urban agenda. The world's cities are fundamental front lines on sustainable development, vulnerable to disaster, yet vectors of innovation and dynamism. Let us not forget that more than 50% of humankind already lives in cities, and this number will reach almost 70% in 2050. Next year, in short, gives us a wealth of opportunities to stop the plunder and start the healing. And one of our best allies is nature itself. Drastically reducing deforestation and systematically restoring forests and other ecosystems is the single largest nature-based opportunity for climate mitigation. Indeed, nature-based solutions could provide 1/3 of the net reductions in greenhouse gas emissions required to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the World Economic Forum has estimated that business opportunities across nature could create 191 million jobs by 2030. Africa's Great Green Wall alone has created 335,000 jobs. Indigenous knowledge, distilled over millennia of close and direct contact with nature, can help to point the way. Indigenous peoples make up less than 6% of the world's population, yet are stewards of 80% of the world's biodiversity on land. Already, we know that nature managed by indigenous peoples is declining less rapidly than elsewhere. With indigenous peoples living on land that is among the most vulnerable to climate change and environmental degradation, it is time to heed their voices, reward their knowledge, and respect their rights. Let's also recognize the central role of women. The impacts of climate change and environmental degradation fall most heavily on women. They are 80% of those displaced by climate change. But women are also the backbone of agriculture and key stewards of natural resources. They are among the world's leading environmental human rights defenders. And women's representation in national parliaments has been linked directly to the signing of climate action agreements. As humankind devises strategies for natural resource governance, environmental preservation, and building a green economy, we need more women decision makers at the table. Dear friends, I have detailed an emergency, but I also see hope. I see a history of advances that show what can be done, from rescuing the ozone layer to reducing extinction rates to expanding protected areas. Many cities are becoming greener. The circular economy is reducing waste. Environmental laws have growing reach. At least 155 United Nations member states now legally recognize that a healthy environment is a basic human right. And the knowledge base is greater than ever. I was very pleased to learn by President Bollinger that Columbia University has launched a climate school, the first new school here in a quarter of a century. Congratulations. This is a wonderful demonstration of scholarship and leadership. And I'm delighted to know that so many members of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network are with us today as special guests, university presidents, chancellors, deans, faculty, and other scholars. The United Nations Academic Impact Initiative is working with institutions of higher education across the globe, and the contributions of universities are essential to our success. Dear friends, a new world is taking shape. More and more people are recognizing the limits of conventional yardsticks, such as gross domestic product, in which environmentally damaging activities count as economic positives. Mindsets are shifting. More and more people are understanding the need for their own daily choices to reduce their carbon footprint and respect planetary boundaries. And we see inspiring waves of social mobilization by young people. From protests in the streets to advocacy online, from classroom education to community engagement, from voting booths to places of work, young people are pushing their elders to do what is right. And we are in a university. This is a moment of truth for people and planet alike. COVID and climate have brought us to a threshold. We cannot go back to the old normal of inequality, injustice, and heedless dominion over the earth. Instead, we must step towards a safer, more sustainable, and equitable path. We have a blueprint, the 2030 Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Agreement on climate change. The door is open, the solutions are there. Now is the time to transform humankind's relationship with the natural world and with each other. And we must do so together. Solidarity is humanity. Solidarity is survival. That is the lesson of 2020. With the world in disunity and disarray, trying to contain the pandemic, let's learn the lesson and change course for the pivotal period ahead. And I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that inspiring talk, and thank you for also agreeing to take questions from our audience, our virtual audience.
Delighted.
My glasses. So my name is Maureen Ramo. I'm a climate scientist. I'm a Columbia professor, and I'm also the interim director of Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. That for 72 years has been the center of Earth and climate research at Lamont, at Columbia University. So it is an honor to be here. And we are also joined today by a virtual audience of Columbia students, faculty, and staff, as well as by the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Welcome, all of you. I can see you all on these Zoom screens here. So I'd like to start the Q&A with a few questions, and then we'll turn it over to the students. But first of all, thank you, Secretary General, for such an inspiring talk. And I would like to ask you that you have made a compelling case for a coalition of actors and stakeholders to commit to a net zero future. What would you do to help grow such a coalition?
I think the most important is to strengthen partnerships and to build alliances. There are things we can do by ourselves, but let's be honest, we need to do this together. And so we need to strengthen our partnership with member states, first of all. We are moving in the right direction. As I said, with the decisions of the incoming administration, we will be at a level of countries representing 65% of global emissions committed to net zero. But we still have India, we still have Turkey, we still have Russia, we still have many other important emitters. We need to bring them on board. And we need to engage directly with them and with their public opinions, with their civil society, with their businesses, in order also to link with their governments and to make sure that the governments move in the right direction. Then alliances with the business community. I must say, I see the business community moving very quickly. I see companies, I see banks asking governments to do things,
Yes.
to reestablish the transparency and I would say, the fairness of markets. Because the way markets are today influenced by governments distort markets in favor of climate change.
Yes.
Subsidies to fossil fuels, the way several regulations are still making difficult for renewable energies to make progress, and I could go on and on with examples. And I see the business community pushing, and we are creating alliances with several areas of the business community everywhere to make sure that they lead in this process. The civil society and the youth. We have a youth movement that we are doing everything possible to connect with. In every summit, we want to have a youth summit before the political summit to make sure that there is a strong influence of the voices of youth. We need to increase the institutional mechanisms of linkage between youth movements and political institutions. And we have created our own youth advisory group and trying to make sure that the voice of the youth pushes the elders to do the right thing. So it's building alliances, it's pushing everybody everywhere that will be able to overcome the resistances. There are resistance because of the routine and the traditions in government action. For instance, why should we have taxes only on income and not on carbon?
Absolutely.
If we reduce taxes on payroll and put those taxes on carbon, everybody wins. But it's difficult to make governments move in this direction. Canada has done it, by the way, and others would easily do it, but it's difficult. Then we have the lobbies. I mean, we know the industries that still are lobbying against climate action. So we need to overcome many resistance, and for that we need this global alliance to gain strength. And what we see ourselves as UN is a catalyst, is trying to link, is trying to encourage, is trying to advocate for, and to do ourselves what we need to do in our own activities.
As an oceanographer, I would say this is an all-hands-on-deck moment, which is what you've just described. My second question concerns economics. You highlighted the critical importance of finance to drive the transformation of our economies and societies, and you just touched on this. And can you be more specific about the steps needed to be taken to secure that much-needed finance?
Well, first of all, it's necessary that states assume their responsibilities. Countries have committed in Paris to $100 billion to support the developing world from public and private sources, and this is not happening. And we have a system in order to have an adequate and I would say reliable way to measure it. It is clear we are below that level. And for instance, the Green Climate Fund has been clearly underfunded. And so there is a lot governments themselves need to do to fulfill their commitments. But this is not going to be solved with public funding. We need blended finance of private and public sources. And the role here of the multilateral development banks, national development banks, is very important. We just had a meeting in Paris of all national and multilateral development banks in the world. And it's essential that they do the kind of partnerships that are necessary with the private sector, with guarantees, with insurance mechanisms, with co-investments, in order to make sure that they facilitate the movement into the developing countries of both private finance and private investments. And then we need the private sector, but for that it's very important to give the right signals. Again, signals in tax, signals in subsidies, signals in regulation, because I see asset managers very interested in decarbonizing their portfolios. And it's obvious. I mean, if I own shares of companies that have no future, it makes sense to get rid of those shares and to buy shares of companies that have future. Yes. So we need to create the conditions in which those that move finance globally, from ministries of finance to central banks, 18 are already doing stress tests taking into account climate. And we have asked for the task force for that purpose has already clearly indicated with the gold standard. We have asked to make mandatory climate-related risks financial disclosures. These will give a very strong signal that markets should represent the reality of the economies and that assets should be what they really are and not what sometimes they pretend to be. And I think that if those things happen, we will see a massive flow of private finance into both climate mitigation and climate adaptation, into both reducing emissions and supporting the need to protect populations, to protect cities, to protect wetlands in relation to the already devastating impacts of climate change.
Thank you. We need a financial tipping point. So we're going to transition now to this beautiful audience here on the screen, and they have some questions. And I think the first one is going to be pulled up, possibly Charlotte.
Hi, my name is Charlotte Munson, and yes, there I am. I'm studying sustainable development right now at the Earth Institute. Thank you, Secretary General, so much for being here today and for that inspiring speech. Sometimes it can feel like our position as individuals in the global discourse is dictated by the stance of our national leaderships. How do you recommend that we, as American citizens or citizens of any nation for that matter, act as international citizens and work to achieve these global goals that you've discussed today?
Well, there are many fronts in which you can act. You can act first as citizens. You can reduce your own carbon footprint, and you can put pressure on your families and on your friends to do the same. I had recently a very interesting discussion in the house of an old friend of mine, and his granddaughter was telling him, we eat too much red meat in this house. And so we can reduce our footprint. We can engage with civil society movements, and we can be very active in our cities to push for the greening of the cities. And we can put political pressure, and we can create networks to put political pressure. The US will have to make a number of very important choices in the years to come. I do believe that there is no way to address the climate emergency in the world without US leadership. And we all remember that the Paris Agreement would not have been possible without the US leadership at the time, and even there was a famous summit between Obama and Xi Jinping that created the conditions also to bring China on board. So I do believe that everything you can do to make cities, states, and the federal government assume leadership globally for climate action is very important. And you can use the internet, you can use all the social media platforms, you can use all the associations that are formed, you can be a member of them, you can, I mean, there are so many things you can do, and I'm sure that I trust the American people to make sure that this country will assume the global leadership that is necessary for climate action to be successful.
Thank you. Next question.
Yes, hello, here I am.
Please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Kevan Rahnamun. I'm doing a master's in global thought at Columbia. Mr. Secretary General, thank you very much for your talk and for addressing all of the emergencies that we're facing. In your TED Talk in October 2020, you urged each country, each city, company, bank, and international organization to have a transition plan to reach zero net emissions. How exactly will the UN incentivize governments and big oil corporations to react? Is it a responsibility matter, or does it go beyond that? Thank you.
I think it's everybody's responsibility. First, governments need to present now their national determined contributions. The national determined contributions are the commitments decided in Paris, in the Paris Agreement, that each government needs to present with what it is intended to do in relation to both mitigation, adaptation, and support to the developing world. Now, it is essential that at the present moment, governments, and they have 2021 to do so, present their plans, and we are insisting in that presentation that reduce emissions by 45% in relation to the levels of 2010. This is a commitment governments must make, and they need to take the policies and the measures in the tax systems, in the subsidies, in the investments, in the incentives that are necessary for that to happen. But on the other hand, we need to make companies do the same. And to make companies do the same, we need to create rules. And one of the rules is to make mandatory that companies and banks present their own, that they have their own disclosure of climate risks. Because if they have to present their climate risks, they have to adopt their plans in order to also move into net zero. And the same applies to all other entities, being cities, being states. I think it's very important to create the regulatory frameworks and the incentives to make every entity have that plan. And then, for instance, those that are investors in companies, they can go to the general assemblies and then can ask the companies to do so. And we are seeing more and more resolutions in the general assembly of companies forcing companies to move in this direction, and more of these resolutions being approved. So, I mean, we need to mobilize every single ally that we can have in the business community, in the local authorities, in governments, in the general public, in youth movements, everywhere. We need to mobilize all to put pressure for each entity to present their plan. And it's very important that each entity has a plan, because that will give that entity also credibility in relation to finance, in relation to government, in relation to their clients. I mean, today when I buy a product, I'm interested in knowing whether or not the company that produces that product is in line with the net zero objective. And when I work in a company, I feel more and more people want to work in companies that are doing the right thing from the climate point of view. So to present those plans and then to implement them is a way for companies, for businesses, but also for cities and for all other entities to gain credibility more and more with the general public that is becoming more and more determined in making sure that we rescue our planet.
Thank you very much. Next question.
Morning, Secretary General. My name is Keisha, and currently I'm doing my MS in Technology Management. My question for you is, so currently I'm in India, Bangalore, and my question for you is, how do you influence or deal with countries, especially the leaders who think climate change is a hoax?
Well, first of all, that's not the case in India. In India, you have the tradition of the Vedas that are one of the oldest texts in the world that preach the need of harmony between nature and humankind. So you are particularly well placed within your culture to make sure that things are done. And look at Mahatma Gandhi and what he represents. So when talking to Prime Minister Modi, I don't go to the technical arguments. I go to these things that are deeply rooted in your values, in your culture, in your identity as a people. On the other hand, the scientific demonstrations of the impacts of climate and what we see every day, I mean, in hurricanes and floods, in drought that is undermining the living conditions in large parts of, namely India, but also in Africa and Latin America. I mean, when we see the wildfires, I mean, from California to the Siberia to the Amazon, when you see all these, I think it's practically impossible for people to go on saying that climate change is a hoax. So, I mean, there are so many proofs, so many things we can show that this is not the most difficult thing. The most difficult thing is to convince those that must take the right decisions to do it. and to overcome the interests that still oppose to climate action.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Shia Bastida, and I'm part of the youth climate activist movement with Fridays for Future and Re-Earth Initiative. Thank you so much for your address. It was really intentional, and you touched on a lot of points that are really important. My question is, what do you expect to see from COP26 and future COPs, especially considering that countries spend a lot of time talking about smaller frameworks like Article 6, and what spaces do you think can be created to make youth participation more meaningful?
Well, I've participated myself in several COPs, and in two of them as Secretary General of the United Nations. And I must say, it's sometimes a frustrating exercise, because one of the problems is that decisions must be taken by consensus. So it's easy for spoilers to make things difficult. We now need to create a massive pressure globally to make sure that on the way to COP26, countries present their national determined contributions that are ambitious enough to guarantee that we move to net zero in 2050 and that we, for that purpose, reduce emissions by 45% in the next decade, and present whatever is needed to do so as measures and policies and instruments, and at the same time commit to the financial instruments that are necessary to support the developing countries. This is something that we need to put pressure on countries, and this needs to be done before the COP. It's not in the COP that this is decided, it's by each country, each government. They need to present it before the COP. And in the COP, we need to be able to increase ambition in mitigation, in adaptation, in finance, and we need to solve this problem of the Article 6. The Article 6 is related to the carbon markets. And until now, there has been a lot of difficulties in addressing the transition between what was in the Kyoto Protocol to the present system. We need to overcome the differences that still exist. We need to do a lot of active diplomacy in the months to come to make sure that we create an effective global carbon market as an instrument to reduce emissions. And sometimes the risk, if we don't do it properly, is to do it in a way that stimulates emissions instead of reducing them. So there are some risks there, and we need to be very attentive for Article 6. It's very important for Article 6 to be regulated in a way that indeed contributes to the reduction of emissions worldwide and to the investment in the green economy in all dimensions.
These are such great questions. Next question.
Hello, my name is Sovik Chatterjee, and I'm a student at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, pursuing a master's in public administration. Could you elaborate on what the United Nations is doing to increase and protect mangrove forests?
You meant forests?
Mangrove forests.
Sorry?
Mangrove forests.
Mangrove forests. Well, I mentioned mangrove forests in my intervention, and especially when we see areas that are in risk of the increase of the level of the sea, it is absolutely essential to have a very meaningful policies, both in supporting the mangrove forest that exists and in increasing its dimension. So what we are doing now is through our country teams, working with governments to make sure that this is put into their own strategies and into their own policies, the governments that are relevant for this purpose, in the recovery from the COVID, and to use the money of the recovery from the COVID to do the kind of investments in the green economy that make sense, and none of the investments in the green economy that make sense, and our country teams are very active in this regard, is exactly in increasing the mangrove forests that are a fundamental protection against the rising sea level.
Absolutely. Next question.
Thank you for your time and insight, Secretary General. My name is Sean Bunner-Cheldham, and I'm a Columbia Business School MBA student. The question I have is, what is the role you think we can play in the institutional investor community in ultimately taking us in the decade we have till 2030 to achieve the SDGs and help bridge some of the financing gaps we currently see? In the context of that, as I previously worked in institutional impact investment before CBS, and certainly saw that there are opportunities in both things like sustainable infrastructure as well as outcomes-based financing. But what would your guidance be on specific products, sectors, or areas that we can really have the greatest impact as we look to serve people on the planet through the capital markets?
I'm sorry, I couldn't understand.
Yeah, can you repeat the very last part of your question? You cut out a little bit.
Sure. So my question was, Secretary General, what do you think our priorities should be as the institutional investor community? Is it focusing on specific sectors, specific geographies, specific SDGs, as we look to have the greatest impact with the capital markets to serve people and the planet?
Well, we have been working hard with asset owners in building the alliance, and we have been working hard with, I was present in the summit of the national development banks, regional development banks and multilateral development banks. We are working hard with pension funds, and we are working hard with all of them. And the idea is that, first of all, they should decarbonize their portfolios. That is the main objective, to decarbonize their portfolios and to align in general the portfolios progressively with the Sustainable Development Goals, to not to have any more investments in coal, to progressively reduce the investments in fossil fuels in general, to increase the investment in renewable energies and other green aspects, and to request from companies the disclosure of their climate risks, and to request from companies their own transition plans, the companies in which they invest, their own transition plans to net zero. This is a movement that is gaining ground. These alliances are growing in numbers and in impact. And if you look at the conclusions of the summit in Paris of the national development banks and multilateral development banks, that many of these orientations are already assumed by all of them. In their action. And we will going on doing everything we can to make sure that the financial sector in general, but the investors in particular, become one of the key drivers of this process. But there is another thing they can do, which is to put pressure on governments. To put pressure on governments to adopt the measures and to adopt the rules that facilitate this movement. And for instance, in relation to taxation, for instance, in relation to subsidies, for instance, in relation to different kinds of energy regulations, a lot governments still need to do to make sure that things move in the right direction. I was told recently by a very important investor that there has been a lot of difficulties in creating the conditions to bring electricity produced in Canada by renewable sources to New York. And because of the regulations in between. So there is a lot of pressure that needs to be done on governments to make sure that they also do the right things to allow the investors to do what they believe is the right thing to do without having to pay a price for doing it.
Thank you. Next question.
Hello, my name is Kaoru. I am pursuing Master of Public Administration at Columbia. In 2012 and 2014, I attended COP18 and COP20 as a Japanese youth delegate. So my question is really simple. What would you do if you were back in your 20s or 30s? In another word, what would you expect as the young generation, the next generation, for the better future and the better planet?
Well, the truth is that your generation is today leading. I believe that there has been a very important change in the global public opinion and in the political discussions in the last year. If you look at the number of countries that have committed to net zero, it has increased substantially in the last year. When we did our summit, our Climate Action Summit in October of 2019, we had committed to net zero just small countries. I mean, small islands and another small. Now, as you have seen, things are moving. And one of the reasons things have moved was the youth movement. And the youth movement had a dramatic impact. Dramatic impact directly because of the activities that took place and the testimonies that were given and the movements that were established, but also because I see more and more people directly influenced by their children and their grandchildren, starting by myself. I mean, so the youth movement has an enormous strength by what you do directly and enormous strength by what you manage to make others do. And one of the things I believe you need to also ask is for more institutional channels for your voice to be heard in decision-making processes. For the moment, youth can influence, but the voice of the youth is not institutionalized in decision-making processes. And we need, at national level, at city level, or at a global level in organizations like the UN, to create institutional mechanisms in which the voice of the youth is taken into account when decisions, namely decisions for the climate, are taken. And there is still a long way to go, and you need to put pressure on that, because you know this is a matter of power. And my experience as a former politician is that power normally is not given. Power normally is taken. So you young people, you need to take power.
Great advice. Next question.
Mr. Secretary General, thank you so much for speaking with us today. My name is Lee Nussbaum, and I am a student at the School of International and Public Affairs, pursuing a degree, an MPA in development practice. And my question is we're about 10 years away from 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. And I was wondering, what would you prioritize to make sure that we can remain on target and hit those goals that are related to climate? Thank you.
Well, as I said, this is something in which you cannot prioritize some things and forget about others. You now need to have an holistic approach. Everything is interlinked. You need to deal with climate action, direct climate action, but you need simultaneously to protect the oceans, to protect biodiversity, and to do all the other things that I've mentioned. Because, look, I mean, the oceans are capturing the overwhelming majority of the heat that comes to the Earth. But because of that, they are acidifying. And as they are acidifying, corals, for instance, are bleaching, and biodiversity is decreasing in the oceans, and that has an impact on the food chain, and that could have a dramatic impact in the resources that we can obtain from the sea. At the same time, we are with what we do in deforestation. We are simultaneously with forest fires, for instance, in the Amazon. We are sending CO2 to the atmosphere, and we are destroying those that capture CO2. So, I mean, when you fight land degradation, when you fight deforestation, when you fight the destruction of biodiversity, when you fight the pollution in the oceans, you are fighting for climate action. And when you fight for climate action, you are protecting the oceans and you are protecting biodiversity. So all these things are interlinked. And I believe it is the idea that there is no quick fix that is important. We need to act on all fronts. Of course, there is one thing that is central. We need to reduce emissions. To reduce emissions, there are a number of key industries, and we need to give priority to those key industries. So energy is essential, steel is essential, cement is essential, transportation is essential. I mean, cars, look at the impacts. I mean, we need to have electric cars and hydrogen-powered cars as soon as possible all over the world. So there are things that we need to do, but we need to do in all fronts, because it's the planet as a whole that is at stake, and things need to be seen in a holistic way. Everything is interlinked, and the life of people is interlinked with the life of the planet, and the life of the planet has all these dimensions that need to be addressed at the same time.
It's so true, and people need to realize that the damage to the ocean is irreversible on a human timescale. I mean, what we are doing, we can't walk it back.
I come from a country that is very deeply linked to the oceans, Portugal, and I can tell you, to see, for instance, we have plastics coming into the ocean, and if nothing is done, and something is being done but not enough, in 2050 we will have more weight, the plastics will have more weight than fish in the oceans. Oh. This is absolutely unacceptable. Now, in 2019, the volume of plastic going per day to the oceans had the weight of 90 aircraft carriers. I mean, this gives an idea of how we are destroying the oceans, the speed at which we are destroying the oceans. And this is something we need to really change course.
Absolutely. We have another question.
Hello, Secretary General Guterres. My name is António. I'm an undergraduate student at Columbia College. In our increasingly interconnected polarization.
The sound is very bad.
Yeah, we can't hear
I don't
you.
know if it's too close or too far.
Can you try a little closer to the microphone, maybe?
Sure. So my name is Ilkan Milani. I'm a student at Columbia College. In our increasingly connected world, we witness greater polarization with a growing number of people deciding by who they're against rather than what they're for. In your view, how critical is a renewed sense of pluralism, both within countries as well as on the global stage, in order to make further progress on the 2030 goal and ensure more people?
I don't understand. Can you help me?
Tell me your name again.
My name is Ilkan.
Hi, good morning. Thank you,
Okay,
Mr.
thank you.
Secretary General.
Sorry about that.
I'm terribly sorry, but we couldn't understand the words.
Yeah, I couldn't find your name here.
These technologies have still some glitches.
So, welcome.
Hi, good morning, Mr. Secretary General. Thank you for the inspiring talk. May I have a question? So the governments always advocate the world conserving energy and materials. However, as I see, many individuals don't do so. So my question is, do the government or United Nations have the plan to educate people on how to conserve materials and energy exactly? Thank you.
Well, this is an essential priority. If one looks at, for instance, food loss and waste, between food loss and food waste, we are losing 25 to 30% of the food produced in the world. And this has an impact on global emissions of about, I'd say, probably 7 to 10%, because agriculture is still very important in emissions. So to reduce waste is a must in the way we work and in the way we eat and in the way we, in the way we live, to recycle systematically things and not to. Then, if you look at energy, it's very important to move from fossil fuels to renewable energy, but it's even more important not to spend energy, to conserve energy. I mean, one of the things that I find amazing in a city like New York is the number of lights, of windows in which I see light during the night and nobody is there. So energy is being spent for nothing, which means we are making emissions without any purpose. So to be able to only use resources exactly as we need them is something that requires a cultural change. We live in a culture of waste. No, we think that whatever we can afford, we can use. It's not true. We can use whatever we need. It's not because we have the money to afford it that we have the right to use it. Because what we are dealing with is limited resources in the world, and our footprint in the world is bigger than the world itself. Our collective footprint in the world is bigger than the world itself, which means we are destroying the world. And the way to avoid it is to make everybody understand that in our consumption, in our attitudes, in the way we move, that we do what we need, but we don't waste. Because the waste is, to be honest, a crime against humankind and a crime against the planet.
Absolutely. So I think we have time for another question.
Hi, Secretary General. Thank you for speaking to us today. My name is Yowen Duan. I'm a high school senior at Columbia Secondary School, and I'm afraid my question is a little bit generic, but may I ask, what do you say to the current generation of young people who each want to become who they want to be and make the world a better place in this entire context of a post-pandemic world of tension, distrust, political polarization, and the social and political, social and international mobilities are declining in this post-pandemic world? Thank you so much.
Well, I would say only three things. Be yourselves, think with your own heads, and look at the mistakes we have made to make sure you don't repeat them.
Good advice. So how about one last question? Do we have another question queued up? Welcome.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to meet you. I am Flávia Maia. I work for the local government of a climate hotspot in Brazil. And I'm also an Obama Scholar, which is a program that connects emerging leaders that act in their community. So I want to ask, what is the role of small and medium cities like mine in this world that is of increasing social, environmental, economic vulnerability, and what we can do and how we can find support to advance the climate agenda from bottom to up?
Sorry, I didn't understand very well. Can you?
State your question again?
I would like to ask how we can advance the climate agenda from bottom to up, especially in municipalities where there is environmental vulnerability.
In places where there are environmental vulnerabilities?
How we can advance the climate agenda from bottom to up.
Okay.
Okay.
Grassroots, I guess.
Well, it's mobilizing the civil society. I mean, there is a German philosopher that was very important in my own in development of my own political thinking, called Habermas. And Habermas, one of his contributions is to say that what is essential, one of the things that is essential in a modern democracy is the permanent flow of intercommunication between the civil society and the political society, and the fact that that intercommunication has an influence on the decisions that are taken at any moment. So the participation is not just voting, it's a permanent interflux of communication between the civil society and the political society. And that's what you need to do. You need to mobilize your civil society at all levels, youth movements, NGOs of different kinds, business community, city organizations. You need to mobilize everybody to be vocal, to be active, and to demand from the governments, local and national government, what needs to be done, and to do things by yourselves that force the governments to act in the same direction. So it's, to a certain extent, it's to assume the influence that you have, and today, I mean, the instruments that the civil society has at its disposal are huge. I mean, the new technologies give us enormous possibilities to influence societies and to influence the political life of a country and the institutions of the country. So use those instruments as much as you can, make as much noise as you can, do your things, lead by example, and make sure that those that misbehave are held accountable.
Secretary General, thank you so much for such an inspiring speech, for giving us a vision of what the world should be, what it could be, indeed what it has to be. And thank you to all the members of the audience, and especially the people who asked questions. Thank you so much.
No, and thank you very much to you and to Columbia University for this wonderful opportunity. And I wish all of you all the best. And speaking to the students, I mean, assume the leadership that is needed, and make sure that you are able to give the world what, unfortunately, my generation was not able to do. And we are here to learn from you, to be able, in what we still can do, to do the right thing and to make sure that we move to a planet where humankind and nature can live in harmony.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That was beautiful.
Thank you very much.